Welcome to BT Podcasts. In this episode, find out how families can tackle sensitive wealth transfer and succession discussions and move into the future together. This podcast is produced in partnership with Barclays Private Bank.
All right, so we're talking about something that hits closer to home for every family, but we rarely chat about it. It's the passing on of wealth. It's way more than just money these days. It's about lining up what truly matters to everyone and building a legacy that feels meaningful. Stick around as we figure out how families and their wealth professionals can tackle these tricky talks, turning potential headaches into chances to really get each other. Welcome to BT Podcasts by the Business Times. I'm Howie Lim, and joining us today, Evonne Tan, head of Barclays Private Bank Singapore.
Thank you for inviting me today.
A bit of a tricky thing to talk about, isn't it? There are these complexities of intergenerational wealth transfer, especially when values diverge a great deal. Are there specific, say, mechanisms or frameworks that families can use?
Exactly as you say, it's sometimes a taboo subject, and a lot of families don't want to talk about it. When you talk about transfer of legacy and wealth strategies, it's really talking about passing on of somebody in the family, death and all that, especially Chinese families and maybe a lot of other families as well. It's a taboo subject. That's one of the issues that a lot of families face. First and foremost, there needs to be that understanding. There needs to be communication. There needs to be transparency. There needs to be early discussion about these topics, to not just foster communication, but also to bring clarity, provide structure to let everybody know what's going on. And then you can actually help to create a smoother transition as well. One of the key things is really to have that discussion early with family meetings. Very simple. Get people together to start talking about what is it that we have as a family, wealth, financial assets, but also about non-financial assets, right? The intangibles. And that could mean, what do we as a family, how do we define family? It could be as basic as who is family? Who do you include as family, whether it's son-in-laws or daughter-in-laws or extended family? So that's even basic questions. And going on into what are the assets that we have? What are the financial structures, especially for large, complex families, also where they may have assets in many different parts of the world, but maybe they don't tell anyone about it. For example, even just sort of having that mapping exercise on looking at what they have, etc. For those with more significant wealth, actually creating structured documents, governance documents, what we call a family constitution or family charter, a document that can guide the family and articulate what the family's values, vision, mission is, defining roles and responsibilities within the family, and also decision-making frameworks, voting protocols, avoiding conflicts in the future, or, how do you resolve conflicts, and also just succession plans, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot, right, especially for large families, business families. How do you look into the business as well as the personal wealth? So that document can really help to guide the family, using that as a starting point for many other things that can, follow on from there.
Something like that on paper can effectively articulate, obviously, how the family wants their financial assets and even their non-monetary elements to be handled and taken care of and passed down. But how would it help the younger generation embrace it? It feels a bit like, this is what we're doing, here it is on paper, read it and follow, so to speak.
I think yes and no. It's just a matter of how. When we talk about that document, that's the what, that is the guiding document. But how do you get to that document? And so that's really about the process of creating the document. It has to be a collective effort where the older generations and the newer generations, not like the older generations, I'm writing it down and this is what it is. I mean, they could do that, but obviously, as you pointed out, then that's not really bringing in the next gens into the conversation. When we talked about communication, etc., what does it really mean? It's really creating clarity and transparency. But it also is meaning that whatever, especially intangibles as well, is making it more concrete, but also to bring the ownership to the next gen. It's like a co-creation. Invite, in fact, professional advisors into the family. And some
referees.
Yes. And in fact, sometimes when you have a third party and a neutral third party, it actually opens up conversation, because sometimes they're like, I don't want to talk to my dad. You know how family dynamics are. When you go through a mediator, if you want to put it that way, it does. And we've seen many cases where they are more open and that different conversation happens, and it helps to bring people together. Third-party professional advisors who are specialized in wealth dynamics and family governance, they come to facilitate, to bring people together, do different exercises and workshops, etc., where they can help to identify shared values, help each other understand each other. And what is it that you want to do together as a family? So it's a collective effort. To be honest, that is not a legally binding document. You're right. It is really just a guiding document. For those families that have done that, have always said that that actually really helped. I mean, nothing is perfect. And of course, they need to improve it. It's a living document as well, continuously to be adapted as it continues to have to stay relevant. If you have a document that helps to guide the family, but then the family continues to expand and there will be newer generation, and decades later, it could not be relevant anymore. With a lot of that facilitation or facilitated retreats or meetings, they do it regularly. Could be every year, every 2 years, come together and do the same sort of exercise and value alignment again.
Sounds good, because I'm thinking, I hate to be stereotypical, but older generations tend to want to prioritize the preservation of the wealth. And then younger generations, as their values change and they become more socially conscious, they want to incorporate innovative financial instruments maybe to make sure that their money's doing good for the greater society as well. So that exercise really gets the two together to figure out how they could find a middle ground, right?
Yes, I think you're right there where values diverge. But one of the values or shared common interests that we've seen quite commonly across families, across generations, is this topic of giving back. In fact, giving back and purpose and impact is something that is quite shared between older and newer generation. The older generation, typically, of course, the creators of wealth, and they would want to preserve it. But they also feel gratitude for what they've received. They also want to give back to society. And the newer generation also want to give back, but it's a different way of thinking. They're more thinking around, I'm an inheritor, I have this wealth, but I want to use that for good. It's about how wealth is used, not necessarily just for consumption, but also for contribution to society. So it's the same shared intention of giving back, but maybe a different way of expressing it or deploying it. And that has a little bit of a link also towards risk appetite. The older generation tends to be more towards donations and charity and philanthropic giving. It would be giving with not necessarily any financial return because it's charitable giving. Then the newer generation may be thinking innovative financial instruments or maybe impact investing. I want to invest into a company that is doing some innovation for climate change. On that basis, there is this wide spectrum. There's no right or wrong, one or the other. But with that spectrum of, let's say, investment opportunities or way to deploy capital for good, you would have, on one hand, the philanthropic giving. You give 100% social with no expectation of a financial return. On the other hand, traditional investments, you invest for financial return without thinking about social good. And anything in between that spectrum is actually a combination of both financial return and social impact. And for some investments, it could be finance first with some social good, or there will be some investments that will be social first. For example, it could be a social bond where it would be a limited financial return with bond returns. Proceeds of that is going to do some good. Exactly when we talked about having that family committee discussion, if we have a shared purpose around giving back, and then how do we deploy that? Discussion around collective jointly. Okay, maybe it could be asset allocation where some parts of it is philanthropic giving and some parts maybe a sleeve into impact. Values, and if you have a shared purpose, it already anchors that and it will help to bring a lot forward.
Hold that thought, Evonne. We're speaking with Evonne Tan from Barclays Private Bank about intergenerational wealth transfer. More in a moment.
And now, back to BT Podcasts in partnership with Barclays Private Bank.
Welcome back. Evonne, earlier we were talking about how the older generation tends to prioritize preservation and then the younger generation wants to do different and more innovative and maybe scarier things with the money. But that seems to be a misnomer. I'm feeling like that's a debunked misconception now. But there are still other sorts of points of contention which may arise during this intergenerational wealth transfer. What might they be? Could you talk us through them?
One of them is, you can say it's a misnomer, but it's still something where there are still differences in the way they think. So there needs to be that collective agreement, especially when it comes to investments and deploying risk appetite. It is true that generally, and of course I'm generalizing, that the older generation may be thought to have less risk appetite and that the newer generation have more risk appetite. I think it's about what you're comfortable with, because the older generation, in fact, a lot of them actually put 100% of their wealth, whatever they've been making, back into the business. You can say that may be risky because it's concentration risk. But for the older generation, that's what I know. And so I'm willing to take that risk. But then I do not understand technology because they're not revenue generating. I don't understand how you can invest in a company that's not revenue generating, as an example. So again, it's about education both ways. Educating older generation, educating newer generation about kind of what they do, but similarly newer generation, it's about familiarity as well, right? Understanding what are some of the newer innovation, etc. And it's interesting where more successful is about the bridging, as we talked about earlier, how we can use some of this to be synergistic to the core business, as an example. Right? Just talking generally, if let's say you have a family that is in property, as an example, the older generation is always, the traditional hard assets and physical assets, and have been doing it for a long, long time. The new generation coming in, and some of them going into the business, some of them could be sort of just managing the wealth, could look at this and say, hey, I could be investing into new innovative digitized companies that look into digital property related innovation. By doing that, you look into what are the new ideas that could be helpful to the business to make it more efficient or to be more relevant in the new world. Incorporating sustainability practices is another, or also going global. So I think what is important, and this both sides need to be aware, meaning older and newer generation, is to think about shared legacy. For example, in this case, the property business is core. And then how can that be relevant also to the core so that they can then bridge together, right? It's not necessarily easy, but that's the reality. That's one way to bridge. Now, once you start thinking, you say, okay, I'll break off and I do my own thing and I don't want to have anything to do with you would then start on that path of divergence even further and further. But if you say, I want to do impact, but I want to do impact that is relevant to my dad's business, property-related innovative investments, I don't know, I'm just, So,
as an example.
Yeah, as an example, right? Yeah, so I think that's the way to look at ensuring that, in many different things that they do, you need to always come back to how do we bridge that awareness of that's how we can keep that family identity together.
Earlier, you talked about how important it is to be educated, both sides, being the older generation or the younger. What sort of specific educational initiatives are there or resources they can tap into?
There's actually a lot of resources out there. So there are some universities in Singapore that actually run business family courses, quite a few in Singapore. They are targeting specifically business families, succession planning. There are also many courses globally, and we've seen some of the wealthy families also go overseas to take some of these courses. Some of them are online. So actually there's a lot of material, a lot of courses available out there, often targeted at the next gens. Now, maybe getting an older gen
to go back
take
to
the
school,
course, maybe not.
No.
I'm not sure. I'm sure there are some who are very open-minded to do that. But that's where we invite professional advisors to come in, and also conducting shared learning journeys. Could be, let's say, I'm interested in certain type of impact investments, maybe going together to visit one of these impact companies, right, that's doing, some innovation. But I think for the newer generation, definitely there's a lot of online courses and all that are currently available.
I'm beginning to really see how important it must be, because earlier you talked about how the document, so to speak, or the mission cannot remain static. It really needs to evolve with, say, shifting economic landscapes. The societal values might change within the family even. How often does it need to be tweaked? How often do family members need to update their education, if you will, and so on?
Well, I don't think there is a
hard and
fast rule. Again, it would be for the family to collectively decide. But as you know, with these things, sometimes they would think, it's not very important. I have many other things to do, and they don't think about it. So I think it's just more that you make sure that it's intentional and conscious, and that you actually have to put it in the diary. But you decide, many families, they go for a family holiday or like a retreat, and then they spend a couple of days for this kind of discussion. through that yearly retreat, for example, they could then update, ensure that they evolve with times and adapt. I think it's also very important to ensure that whatever that you are doing, not just in the constitution, but only any estate plans that you have, succession plans, you should be not too prescriptive about everything, but really is about embedding principles, thinking through what is the essence of what you want to do in terms of the family, whether it's values or whether it's, let's say we talk about a trust and you have a letter of wishes. And we have seen, various cases where maybe decades later and it's not updated and actually things have completely changed. Maybe new members of the family. The world has changed and everyone has taken a different path and it's not relevant anymore. Even that itself, right? You need to embed the essence into the document. Try to keep it a bit more flexible instead of rigid rules. More frequent or regular updates could be yearly, and especially for estate plans, maybe a few years. Maybe every 5 years, because that's a bit different, because with estate plans, and some of them could be more legally binding. A will, for example, needs to be updated. And that can go into the family charter to say, okay, every X number of years, we need to relook at those legal documents or financial structures. With some of them, especially with letter of wishes, etc., with a trust, you need to think through how to make it clear but flexible, to allow for adaptation, allow for the world being different, the family being different in the future.
Let's talk about the world being different. There are global shifts as well in wealth transfer. What are those? Because also, are there the ones that have been happening that require sort of ethical considerations, more responsibility in terms of having the wealth transferred and received by the generations?
Yes, right now, and it's in Asia, obviously, but globally, right? We are now witnessing, especially in the next decade or so, a large amount of wealth that's going to be transferred. So it's an interesting time because, as we talked about earlier, right, a lot of the pitfalls, a lot of the issues that families are facing. And that's why we also feel that a lot of people need to seek professionals to come in to help, especially for families that are large and they're global, and not just global investments, but also some of the family members now are living in many parts of the world. The new world, so to speak, is exactly that. So therefore becomes more complex, cross-border complexities, especially if you have family members. Say, I have family member living in the US, Australia, UK. Quite common these days when people decide to work overseas and stay there with a family. All the more you need to start thinking through. It's a lot more complex than in the past. It used to be, okay, everything's in Singapore. Easy. And so that's one of the trends that we've seen. Investments everywhere, family members everywhere. For this, you really need advisors to come in to help you set up the right financial structures, the right structuring that is necessary to ensure that, you don't have issues with the wealth transfer itself when the time comes. You're right that, we are now coming into a new world where very different from the older generation, whether it's 20, 30, 40 years ago. What we see today is really a lot of disruptive technology. We don't know what that means for the future of work, the future of the world. It is issues around sustainability, climate change, and all that. The newer generation, growing up in this era, they are thinking quite differently. They are seeing a lot of disruption, but they are coming in a time whereby, as an inheritor of wealth, you are in a good position. The older generation is, okay, they need to work hard to create that wealth. For the newer generation, I can help to continue to bring that legacy forward. If I can use that capital for good, we can bring that good into the society in the future, and how you can help to do that. So I think the way it's changing of wealth transfer is really how it's reshaping the way they think wealth can be used. Not so much about collection of assets, but really how they can use that wealth for other purposes. Consumption habits have changed, where the newer generation is more interested in experiences rather than collecting jewelry, for example. It's about the meeting of the minds, identification of values, the anchoring of that values, joint purpose. Then you can have a cohesion and then that continuity.
Evonne, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
This has been BT Podcast by the Business Times. I'm Howie Lim.
This episode of BT Podcast was produced in partnership with Barclays Private Bank.
Find more BT podcasts at businesstimes.com.sg/podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is meant to provide general information only. SPH Media accepts no liability for loss arising from any reliance on the podcast or use of third parties' products and services. Please consult professional advisors for independent advice.